Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look again at the MyLittleGrid add-on to display custom grids in your Windows client applications. This is where we left the MyLittleGrid demo application at the end of the last video. Since that last video was made, MyLittleGrid has now been released under the GNU Lesser General Public License. I'll put links in the description below to where you can download the full library, which gives you access to the full functionality of MyLittleGrid. What we're going to look at today is more things we can actually do to spice up our grid. Now, MyLittleGrid does come with a very extensive help file. We can change the operation of the grid by sending messages to it. Now, there are a great number of messages that we can send to the grid, but we're going to cover these one at a time. So what we want to do today, we have a grid which gives us a number of columns and a number of rows on one grid tab. However, how do we make some changes to this worksheet to change the way it looks? Well, let's have a look at the creation of the grid itself. Here's our Control Add statement where we added a grid to the dialog. And in this, we're actually setting the width of the tab at the bottom of the worksheet, and we're renaming the tab. What we're going to do in here is we're going to put another command in, and we're going to change the color of some of the elements within the grid by using the send message call. This takes several parameters. The first being the handle to the grid, the next being the constant we want to pass to the grid control that tells it what we're going to do. In this case, we want to set the header color, and then we have to tell it which color to set it to. Now, this single line of code would actually change your grid's color scheme. You can, of course, use any color you wish. There's a large number of colours in the built-in RGB colour equates from which you can choose. Some are more suitable than others. Let's try something like this colour. There we go. What we have in our grid at the moment is one column which is read-only. The user cannot change it. We have all the other columns as free text boxes. Let's assume we wish to change the operation of the grid so that the weekday columns were actually checkboxes rather than being free text boxes. How would we go about doing that? Well, after we've set up, down here before we refresh the grid, we're going to put some new code in which is going to change those columns to be checkboxes rather than free text. So in this, we have 8 columns to change from column 2 to column 9. So we'll do this in a for next loop. The library comes with a number of internal functions and subroutines. The one we're after is the one that allows us to set up columns as checkboxes. So we have the MLG format call check, which takes 2 parameters. First being the grid handle, and the second being the column you wish to change. So all we need to do is to paste that in with the hgrid1 as our handle and the long column as the column. So if we try running that now, we'll find that instantly all of our columns are now checkboxes. And they can be ticked or unticked quite happily. Now, you will find yourself, once you start using a lot of grids, of actually doing this kind of thing a lot. So what you can do is you can start to create some generic functions. So what I've done in our MyLittleGrid utilities library is I've created a function whose job it is to fill the grid with checkboxes. This does exactly what we did a moment ago. It works out how many columns are in the grid by using another routine to get the number of columns in the grid which we prepared the last time. It will then step through each of these columns, starting from our column number to the end of the grid, using the format call check subroutine. If we pasted this into the code, we could do away with a few lines of code. As so, passing it the grid handle and the column to start. And there it is. So this is fine for a single tabbed worksheet. What happens if we want to create perhaps a second week and next week tab? How would we go about adding a new tab? Well, this can be done very easily. If we have a look further up the code where we actually set our columns up, in here we're renaming the first tab, which is created by default. We're setting the column headings, and in here what we want to do is we want to put our new tab in here. So we'll need some variables for this. We'll have a name for our new tab. Now we'll need to tell the application how many rows and how many columns to create, but the library does actually give you a big advantage, and if you want to create the same number of rows and the same number of columns, we basically have to pass zeros. And it will create the new tab with the same number of rows and the same number of columns as our first tab. Now, since we may be adding or taking away tabs on a regular basis, this calls for another generic function. We'll call this fun_add_tab. And we want to give it the handle for the grid, the name of our new tab, and we'll put in the number of rows and the number of columns. So all we have to do now is to create a fun_add_tab function, which we'll put in our utilities. And this is it. So we're taking in the parameters, the grid handle, the name of the new tab, the number of rows, and the number of columns. So just as we did before when we renamed the tab, we have to make this an ASCII 255 string. And we're picking up the tab name, we're padding it out with some characters, blank characters at either end just to make it a little more appealing. And then we're using the send message to use the add sheet command. This adds a new tab to our existing grid. And we're using the make long function, the inbuilt make long function, with the rows and the columns to embed this into one parameter. Now there is a return from this function, which is the tab number you have actually added. As we could be using add tab multiple times, since we already have a single tabbed worksheet on the grid, the first time we call this will return 2, as in the tab we just added is tab number 2, and obviously the next time it'll be 3, then 4. So what we can do then is, having created the new tab with the add sheet, we can then send a message to that tab, and we can give it specifically a name. And then the return from our function is the tab number we have actually added. So all we're doing in here is we're giving a name to a new tab. We're not telling it what the headers are going to be. But since we're passing 0 for the rows and the columns, the MyLittleGrid library will quite helpfully create the same number of rows and columns with the same headers. So if we run this now, we haven't created our variables yet. So we go up to the top of our function and we will paste in all the variables we need to use. And we'll try running that now. So there we have our original grid with this week tab. We need to widen this slightly, but there is our next week tab, and if we click on it, we'll see that it has all the column headings, but it does not have the checkboxes. We'll need to set them up independently. But two things we need to do then. We need to widen the space for tabs so we can actually see them both, and we need to add in the checkboxes. So let's have a look to see how we actually do that. Now in our existing code we had a function which set the tab width, so let's just push that up to 300. And now what we want to do is we want to set our checkboxes up. Now, since we've added 2 tabs to this grid, we now have 2 worksheets to work with. So we'll need to tell the application which worksheet we wish to perform functions on. Now, we set up the first worksheet with checkboxes here, so we want to do basically the same thing with the second worksheet, the second tab. But we need to tell the grid which sheet to actually perform the current function on. So we're going to use another send message command. Again, going to hgrid1, and this time we're passing it a constant to tell it that we want to select the sheet. So we're using MLG select sheet, and since we stored the new tab number up here, there's a new tab number, so we know that's number 2. We're passing it down here. So we're telling it to select sheet number 2, and then we're running the fill grid with checkboxes against that sheet. Now if we run that now, we'll see that our space for our tabs is now considerably larger, and we're now sitting on the next week tab. And both tabs are filled with checkboxes. So if you want to switch, having created the second tab, back to the first tab, all we have to do is put another send message command in and switch back to tab number 1. And there we go. We're currently on this week, showing all the data, and on the next week tab, all the checkboxes are checked. So you can quite happily check on the first tab, switch back to the first, make some changes there, switch back to the second, and the values you put on the grid are still there. So you can use this technique to add a number of different tabs. They don't necessarily have to have the same number of columns, nor do they have to have the same data. But if you wish to actually set them up so that they have, My Little Grid will actually accommodate that quite easily with a minimal amount of coding. And once we've done the full setup, we have to make sure that we've actually refreshed the grid to make sure that all the instructions we've given to the grid control are actually going to be displayed on screen. So today we've covered adding tabs and checkboxes to your grid. There will be many more videos on My Little Grid, as there's a great deal we can cover. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.